Let me just start off by saying that this subject we're dealing with, particularly from the U.S., is a deadly serious issue. It is probably no surprise that in the FBI's list now of plotting attacks in the U.S., the domestic terrorism threat has outpaced the threat from al-Qaeda and Islamic State-inspired attacks. They're different in ways that we may get into, but in terms of the numbers, this is now probably at the top of the list of potential attacks in the U.S. So it's a serious issue. Our moderator asked this question about commonalities and differences between the jihadists and far-right extremists. I would just say a couple of quick things on that. One is we've had some interesting cases. One of them is Nicholas Young. If you're not familiar with him, Nicholas Young was arrested by the FBI and he was convicted in 2017. He was involved in Hitler reenactments. He had used as his doormat. He was a member of the Metro Police in Washington. He used as his doormat the Israeli flag as he walked into and out of his house or his apartment. But he also converted to Islam and was an acquaintance of Zachary Chesser and became deeply involved in the jihadist movement in the U.S. So here we have a case when he was arrested that he was both still involved in Nazi reenactment activity and was involved pretty heavily in some of the jihadist chat rooms. So I don't know, maybe he's a confused individual, but he certainly used both sides of this. The other thing is, as we'll see, similar tactics, techniques, and procedures, including ways to radicalize, seek funding, I think, from across the jihadist and the far-right community. So there have been, I think, some similarities. So what I'm going to do here is provide a brief overview, including what I mean, and to highlight how politically sensitive this issue is. Then I want to look a little bit at the data on far-right terrorism, some recent trends, and end with a discussion about what factors are driving far-right extremism in the United States. Three main factors that I'll look at. On the definition, I think if this was entirely an academic audience, which it mostly is, definitions like this are not particularly controversial. By far-right terrorism, I mean, and you can take various definitions from the University of Maryland START to the way Bruce Hoffman defines it, but it's the use or threat of violence by non-state entities whose goals may include racial, ethnic, or religious supremacy, opposition to government authority, and the end of practices like abortion. It's not entirely comprehensive, but it gives one a flavor of what we mean. When I published a report that got some play in the U.S. last year, about this time, right around the time of the Synagogue attack in Pittsburgh, it turned out that it was a politically sensitive term. And I think I was very clear, even in that document, to say that this was not a political, I wasn't equating political parties, but I will tell you what it has led to is the U.S. government's terminology for this is racially motivated violent extremism, RMVE, because there is a nervousness about using right wing because it notes one of the political parties in the U.S. So I define this term, but I note it is a politically sensitive term. What you see in terms of attacks by far-right groups is it's pretty comprehensive. We see attacks, this is just between 2007 and 2017. We see attacks across the U.S. from the East Coast down to Florida and Texas, into southern and even northern California, into the Pacific Northwest. Plenty of areas also in the Midwest. This is a pervasive issue, and this doesn't even include the 2018 or 19 data. The extent of far-right groups is quite varied. They range from a Klan, which is still active, and there have been public demonstrations. The Klan, if you haven't followed its trajectory in the U.S., has evolved in a series of waves. It was very strong at the end of the Civil War in the U.S., and was decimated by then U.S. President Ulysses S. Grant, came back in the 1900s, and it's evolved in various forms. It went down, but I think we're seeing growing recruitment from the Klan in the U.S. We've seen various types of Christian identity groups, neo-Nazi groups, groups that call themselves radical Catholics, a whole range of them. I think what's important to highlight here, at least with the U.S., is while it's helpful to talk about groups in this sense, the vast majority of the far right in the United States is very decentralized. It's along the lines of sort of the Louis Beam leaderless resistance. And I say that in two respects. One of them is the radicalization process often tends to be done in smaller networks. It could be online or personal ones, and the networks become important. So this is not groups per se, which does get into designation questions that I'll touch on a little bit later. But second, the violence component, interestingly, is often individual. When we look at the number of attacks in the U.S. from the far right, these attacks are often, not always, but often done by a single individual. So what we see is a radicalization process that may be done in networks, but an attack process that may be done very individually, and actually with very limited knowledge of people around the attacker. Decides to do it, may announce it as he's doing it or she's doing it, and then try to live stream the attack while they're doing it. So decentralized process. Now, what we see on the far right, I'm not going to show you arrests right now. Arrests appear in 2019 to be going up from last year and the year before. This is the Counter-Terrorism Division at the FBI. So my data comes from domestic terrorism data from the CTD at the Bureau. Their data shows an increase in 2019 plotting and arrests from far-right activity, although we'll get to that complication in a moment. I've included two types of data. One's from the New America Foundation and the other's from the FBI's list of domestic terrorism. They're similar in many ways, but what they do show is a rise in the trend. You'll see in the graphs that I have included 2019 data. That data is good as of about 6 months into 2019. So you're going to see a drop-off. That's because every other year we're looking at is the full year. So take 2019 as a major caveat. And we still have July, August, September, October, November, December not included in this data. I'll wait until the end of the year to include it. What we see is a big spike in 2009, and if you're drawing a trend line here, it is up through 2018. That trend line is increasing. Bureau's data is much more concerning. So is a spike from 2015, 16, 17. It's growing every year in the number of far-right domestic terrorism attacks. 2019 looks like it's dropped off, but that does not include the last 6 months of the year, and we'll see what happens during that time period. There are already some attacks that will add to this category. In terms of levels of violence, let me just go to the FBI data, that we see the number of wounded and killed. The trend lines also, especially the number of killed, are growing. So these individuals that are conducting attacks we're seeing more of them, and they're killing more people. Now, one of the differences between the far right and the Al-Qaeda and Islamic State inspired individuals is the attacks are pretty targeted in the U.S. So I'm just going to skip to the FBI data. So what we see with the plotting from Islamic State and Al-Qaeda attacks is interest, and these are not just the ones we've seen in San Bernardino or Orlando or others, but what we've seen there is an interest in killing as many people as possible, often in very public locations. That could be it could be a mall, it could be a public transportation, it could be an airline that they want to take down. With the far right, it's generally very specific. Now, they may want to kill as many people as they can in specific locations, but it's churches or synagogues, or in the case of the Walmart we just saw, targeting of Mexicans in a border region because they were likely to be shopping there because people were coming in and across the border. So what we see is much more targeted numbers of attacks rather than much broader ones, which means the lethality is likely to be lower than what we see with some of the more successful jihadist attacks or plots in the U.S. The vast majority of the tactics used, as we see here, over the last couple of years have been shootings. Gun access is pretty easy and pretty straightforward. Next to that, stabbings, arson, and then vehicle-borne attacks. This is essentially running somebody over, not unlike what we saw against the Finsbury Park Mosque by a right-wing extremist in the UK. So pretty simple tactics, very difficult to stop because you can't generally legislate against guns in the US. It's a big Second Amendment issue. Can't legislate against knives, matches, or vehicles. So no way, these aren't the high TATP type explosives we might see with some of the plots by Islamic extremists, very simple types of attacks. So I think as we look at the pattern, it's growing. The lethality is likely to still be and continue to be low, but we see a growing number of people killed by far-right activity. Recent trends, I think, are interesting, and they to some degree mirror what we're seeing in Australia. And I'm going to use as a case study the Rise Above movement based out of mostly locations like Southern California. What's interesting about the Rise Above movement is their recognition, and we've seen this in some cases with at least some of the plotters among Islamic extremists in the U.S., so Faisal Shahzad, the Times Square bomber, or Najibullah Azazi, the individual involved in the 2009 core al-Qaeda plots to attack the subways in New York City, is an attempt to blend in. They don't want to stick out as extremists. So the new look that we've seen, and it's indicative of private Facebook posts among members of the Rise Above movement, is to don't be visible as and easily identifiable as white supremacists. So no skinhead look anymore. You cut your hair short, but do it like a military haircut. No steel-toed boots. So maybe a khaki shirt, or as you can see in one of the photographs down here to the bottom right, it's more like, it looks like these guys are going out for a track meet. So very different kind of look, and even careful in how they're talking online to each other, not trying to cross the violence line, using coded language. Much like what we've seen among Islamic extremists, they've often talked about things like weddings or other things to highlight big events that they're involved in. So an effort really to try to minimize their public awareness, because what they recognize is law enforcement agencies are onto them, and it's certainly easier to identify individuals with cameras with a look. So they've tried to make it a little bit more difficult. We see with El Paso too an increasing interest, and I'll come back to this in a moment, of inspiration from the immigration debate in the United States. This concern, as we just heard, about fear of immigration and being taken over by an other. In this case, it's Latinos, including Mexicans in the United States. So part of this is also trying to migrate towards, and this is a part of the recruitment process, trying to pitch their messages in ways that are more mainstream in nature. So if you see on Fox News in the United States debates about immigration, This is taking messages, including taking videos that are coming out of mainstream U.S. Television and using it for recruitment purposes. So this is a much more savvy, it's an OPSEC, much more OPSEC savvy extremist movement than what we've seen, at least in the recent past. Let me end by talking about some drivers of far-right extremism. I think there are at least three issues that I would be concerned about as we move forward, and I think have partially caused this uptick in the threat. The first is the internet and social media, which I'll talk about. Second is the interaction abroad with networks, and this is the physical interaction. And then some kind of exogenous events that have been notable. So first is the internet and social media. And again, we've seen this with some of the jihadist groups. There is a lot of the use, increasing use of social media and the internet for everything from radicalization to communication. And sometimes the communication is just which events are we going to go to, or the training. And this sometimes is just physical training, like which gyms are we going to go to. So using social media to use as a way to congregate fundraising, and it's voice over the internet protocol apps, including Gab, as we've already heard. Internet sites like the Daily Stormer. Although note, if you go on the Daily Stormer, you'll probably be monitored by some number of organizations. But they're pretty careful in espousing hate, but not crossing a line into outright calling for violence. So they've been a little savvy in doing that. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Discord, lots of activity on Discord, 8chan and 4chan, among others. So pretty savvy on the tech side in communicating and radicalizing. A second area is interaction abroad. And the Rise Above movement, which I mentioned earlier, had extensive ties to organizations in Germany. So a number of them came to Germany to celebrate Hitler's birthday. They conducted a range of activities with the Azov Battalion in the Ukraine, traveled to fascist groups in Italy. So growing interaction. The upside of this from the law enforcement intelligence community is, for a while, with groups that remain largely local, at least in the US, since that's what I'm focusing on, this is largely a domestic issue under the auspices of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Once these people start traveling overseas, well, that the US can then bring additional intelligence collection assets into play here, and can start conducting analysis. There was a period about 2 years ago, maybe even later than that, a year ago, where the National Counter-Terrorism Center could not really touch the far right because it was a domestic matter. I think now it's a different situation because these people are traveling overseas. And then finally, three types of recent events I think that have driven this. One is the immigration debate that has inspired the far right in the United States. And this is, note by the way, that while the immigration debate has inspired many of them, and this is a dominant news issue in the U.S., you know, many of them are still against blacks and Jews, and also against Latinos. So just because this is partly an immigration issue, does not mean that those issues confine them to hatred. A second issue was the election of Barack Obama as president of the U.S. As an African American, there was an early Department of Homeland Security report noting growing trends in recruitment into the far right because of an African American president. That continued over Obama's time. And the third issue has been the election of Trump, which has energized even more than Obama energized the far right. Now, I'm not saying anybody here, including the U.S. president, necessarily supports this, but what you should be aware is when the Rise Above movement, a number of those individuals were arrested and prosecuted, they called themselves very specifically Trumpenkriegers, fighters for Trump. And they sort of glommed on to the broader immigration issue. So the basic message here, as I wrap up, is the threat is growing. It is definitely concerning, and I think it's concerning across the board. African American churches, synagogues, these are all targets of the far right. Let me just briefly, in about 15 seconds, end with some of the problems we face. We've got no domestic terrorism statute in the US, so they can't be charged for domestic terrorism. You have to charge a white supremacist with something other than that. The individual in the US Coast Guard, a white supremacist, was plotting attacks, was charged with trafficking. He was charged with trafficking steroids across state boundaries because there's no domestic terrorism statute. So that's the debate about whether that should change. Do you designate these groups? No designation of a domestic organization. No group has been taken down, and you've seen differences in Europe. So there are a range of issues and no domestic material support statute right now to charge an individual with supporting a group. So I think at this point, there's been a shift in resources to keep an eye, but there's still a lot of questions in the US about how to deal and prosecute, arrest, and then convict these kinds of individuals. So with that, I will conclude. Thanks.